Here to discuss this further, I'm joined by one of my favourite humans when it comes to discussing the geopolitics of the world. A very sensible man indeed, a great brain of this nation, Dr Alan Mendoza, who's the founder of the Henry Jackson Society, a US-UK foreign affairs think tank. Alan, how are you doing today? Really great to have you on the show.
And always great to be with you, Alex.
I mean, Richard's right, isn't he, when he says that Hamas are using their own people in Gaza as human shields. And at the very top of the programme, early on at 4 o'clock, I was speaking to Colonel Richard Kemp, who also added, of course, that this is part of the playbook by Iran. They wanted Hamas to go in, commit the most awful atrocities for the sake of optics, to push Israel into a reaction that they could then point the finger at and say, this is our excuse for now bombing you. Is that your read of the situation?
Yeah, I mean, you've got it in one. I mean, basically, the worse the crime at the beginning, the Iranian gamble and the Hamas gamble is people will forget it by week 2 because something will happen on the ground or in the air that will direct attention and make it seem that the Israelis are every bit as bad as those nasty Hamas terrorists. And it almost happened, didn't it, Alex? You saw the chaos around the hospital strike issue where people were willing to blame Israel immediately with no shred of proof at all. And yet, as time has gone on, it seems more and more likely that it was indeed a Palestinian missile, not an Israeli missile that fell on it. So, yes, the playbook is right there. We can see what's being planned and what they're hoping to achieve. And that's why it's so pleasing to see Rishi Sunak and many other Western leaders saying we're not going to be fooled.
But the information warfare, this grey zone warfare, we're seeing increasingly in the 21st century, you know, armies of bots from hostile nations being deployed online to try and shift public opinion. It is largely working. Do we stand at risk, therefore, of having terrorist reprisals here at home? We've let a lot of people into the country. We don't necessarily know what their allegiances are. We've already seen a terrorist attack take place in Belgium, very often the site of terrorist activity. Is there a risk with Rishi Sunak going over to Israel that we could see lone wolf attacks or even organised attacks here on home soil?
Yeah, totally. I mean, right now in Germany, for example, there are huge public fears about rioting going on at pro-Palestinian marches, which could easily be, kind of extended into attacks on other Germans in the way this works. So they're worried. The Belgians are worried. Many other European countries are worried, and we should be worried too. And we should be particularly worried. You mentioned, of course, disinformation as part of this. We should be worried about false stories, enraging and inflaming attitudes on British streets, which then turn out not to be true. And the Prime Minister going to Israel, expressing support. But what happens if tonight another fake news story comes out? Then, some hothead could go, right, it's Britain's fault, let's attack British people. So, yes, very clearly there is a threat from this kind of activity.
And how do we start to counteract some of the disinformation? Because it seems to me that public opinion over the past decade or more is shifting in the direction of Palestine, is prepared to go along with this demonisation of Israel and believe everything that people are being spoon-fed online about how it is a brutal oppressor, forgetting, of course, the fact that when it comes to Israel, if they don't have a place in the Middle East, where do they go? Where do Israelis go and call home? How do we begin to sort of push back against that?
Well, the first thing we have to do is surely expect, the mainstream media to adhere to normative media standards. And that means take a step back when a story like this breaks and go, well, hang on, we don't have the proof for anything. And rather than calling it this way or that way, we're going to sit back and actually and tell people what we're doing. Say, look, we don't know what's happening. Take a step back. Don't rush into judgment until you get there. And that didn't happen, did it, this week? We saw the BBC and Sky in particular, losing their rag, basically, over things. I mean, you saw the Anna Botting interview with Mark Rego, for example, appalling example on Sky. We saw what the BBC's been doing for quite a while here. Surely, mainstream media has a responsibility to report fairly, impartially and accurately from war zones like this, because if you don't do that, you are immediately assisting that process that you have set. So realistically, the facts will win out in the end if they're allowed to win out. But if they're drowned out by lies, then we will end up with a very skewed political discussion and debate.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't think many journalists these days are particularly bright, let alone students of geopolitics. But we're going to try and set that straight on this programme. programme. I'm interested in talking to you about negotiations taking place. Rishi Sunak is going to be meeting with Saudi Arabia. James Cleverly also hot-footing it out to the region. Meetings, of course, with Egypt, a vital country in order to get medication, food and water into Gaza to protect the civilians there. But Egypt have put up barbed wire fences to stop Gazans from coming out. So much for Muslim solidarity.
Well, it is extraordinary to think that in neighbouring countries there is no desire to help Palestinian civilians, Gazan civilians, in this conflict at all. As you say, the Egyptians are doing everything they can to stop Gazans from leaving Gaza. There's no appetite in Lebanon or Jordan, the other neighbouring countries, to Israel to take in any Palestinian refugees who might decide, actually, it's a bit too hot right now to be in Gaza. To be safe, we need to escape in that sort of way. And I think, legitimate questions need to be asked on the round robin that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary are doing about what is the Arab world prepared to do to look after any refugees leaving Gaza, civilians temporarily leaving Gaza, in order to house them locally rather than having them shipped off elsewhere around the world.
It makes me suspect, actually, that some of these particular players wants to see the suffering of Gazan civilians because it gives them an excuse to continue bashing the West and bashing Israel. But there are a number of countries who do seem to be on our side, at least nominally. We've had Saudi Arabia normalising relationships with Israel. That, of course, has been winding up Iran, who the last thing they want to see is Israel able to trade and have a good relationship with neighbouring Gulf states. But Qatar have proven to be very interesting allies and are increasingly acting as interlocutors, first of all negotiating prisoner swaps and the release of hostages in Ukraine and Russia, and now essentially acting as the go-between for the US and Hamas. My understanding is the US themselves asked Qatar to forge links to Hamas. Of course, the Western media constantly portraying this as if, Hamas have their HQs in Doha and it's all cosy and wonderful. But for the past 10 days, Qatar's mediators have been trying to negotiate some sort of situation where food, aid, medicine can get into Gaza. And my understanding is that those messages are being rallied back to the US and indeed to Israel. And Hamas don't particularly want things to escalate. Do you think Qatar, America has air bases there, do you think Qatar are a trusted trader when it comes to acting as an interlocutor?
Well, I don't know if we can call them a trusted trader as such. It's interesting terminology, given that they have played host to Hamas and have supported them for some time. And don't forget that the problem with the Middle East is that you have circles within circles, and what the Qataris have been doing themselves for some time is trying to exert their influence in the Middle East, their, power as seen through, of course, their control of Al Jazeera, firstly, but secondly, some of the diplomacy they've done and some of the forces they backed, such as Hamas. Whereas they've also had a bit of a fight with the Saudis, which ended fairly recently, but there was a boycott, if you recall, of Qatar by many of the other Gulf countries and beyond. So you're constantly seeing jockeying for position. You've got Iran jockeying for position, you've got the Saudis jockeying for position, you've got Qatar jockeying for position. The reason the Qataris are being used as interlocutors in this regard is because they do host the Hamas leadership. And so and they've been used for some time to talk to Hamas about various openings of borders and money transfers and things like that. They've clearly got the ability to exert some influence on Hamas, but let's be realistic here. The people who are actually supporting Hamas militarily and financially are the Iranians, not the Qataris. And there's a limit to what Qatar can do. And there's also a limit to what Qatar will want to do, because it's really about protecting Qatar's position rather than, say, doing the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, very good points made there. And of course, the US does have air bases in Qatar, whereas Iran has used some of the other neighbouring countries, Syria, Lebanon, to host their weapons and their armaments and their air forces. How do you see this playing out? Because it strikes me that this is four-dimensional chess here. If Israel go into Gaza with the complex network of tunnels where Hamas hide, where they use civilian structures, hospitals and schools deliberately as human shields, Iran saying, you put one foot inside the country and we're going to retaliate, and then using the bombardment of that hospital, which we now know to have not been done by Israel, to essentially try and stoke up and inflame the situation in the Middle East. Where do we go from here? Can it be de-escalated?
Well, the one thing we've got to avoid, and the one key pivot to this conflict being contained or exploding, is the involvement of Hezbollah on the northern border of Israel, Hezbollah and Iran, I should say. The reason so much effort is being expended right now on warning the Iranians and Hezbollah off is because if that front opens, you have a second front for the Israelis, firstly. At that point, the Americans have a very tough choice to make, which they will almost certainly resolve by getting involved themselves and supporting Israel, certainly with supply, but probably even with offensive action against Hezbollah and maybe against Iran. You have Iran potentially then playing its own game in the Gulf, maybe attacking some of the US and British Gulf allies in the Gulf, because they can see an opportunity to cause yet more chaos. And before you know it, you've got a regional conflagration. I don't think you can avoid the Israelis going on the ground in Gaza, and nor should we avoid that. The reality is that Hamas have to be removed from Gaza, and the only way you can do that is by a ground campaign. There's no possibility of removing them from the air. So realistically, and it's not a good option for Israel, but realistically, they have no choice but to go on the ground, because you cannot remove a threat without controlling the territory that the threat resides in. So we will expect that to happen, but the key question is, will anything else happen? And that's what we all have to be careful to avoid going forwards.
Indeed. Alan, thank you ever so much. A very fragile situation, a hop, skip and a jump at any moment away from this escalating into something pretty global and pretty terrifying.